Good evening. My name is Selena Jaffrey, and I'm the Director of Business and Policy at Asia Society Texas Center. Thank you for joining us for week 6 of our webcast series on COVID-19, which explores various themes and topics impacting our community. This evening's webcast is on the topic of how immigrants have been impacted by COVID-19. And our speaker is Charles Foster, chairman of Foster LLP, one of the largest global immigration law firms. The discussion tonight will be on all immigrants, including the ones who make up 7% of the US workforce, with 3 of 4 of those immigrants working in jobs such as healthcare and food-related industries, which are deemed essential for fighting the virus. Our moderator for this evening is Texas State Representative Jean Wu. Prior to being elected in 2012, he served as a prosecutor in the Harris County District Attorney's Office. Following the conversation, we'll be taking some questions from viewers, so please share your questions throughout the discussion via the YouTube comment box. Before I hand it to Representative Wu, we're excited to share that we have launched a new project and invite you to join us in the Japanese tradition of Sinbazuru, the folding of 1,000 cranes. Cranes have long symbolized peace, good health, longevity, and healing in many Asian cultures. Just fold an origami crane, share on social media with the hashtag 1000 cranes for hope, and join Asia Society in our wish for a safe and healthy community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Charles, how are you tonight?
I'm doing well. Thank you for moderating this. I know you bring substantive knowledge to the topic as well.
Absolutely. And Charles, you've been practicing immigration law, and you're actually one of the foremost immigration lawyers in the Houston area. How long have you been doing this?
Like a lady who doesn't want to admit her age, I'm reluctant to say, but for more than 4 decades. So I've been practicing immigration law exclusively.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I mean, in that time, you've helped thousands, if not tens of thousands of people get them to work in the United States, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
It's been a very rewarding profession.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the discussion points that I think we've been trying to make is that not only are immigrants important to the United States, but immigrants are really important during this COVID-19 crisis. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Absolutely. Houston is a city, as you know, a city of immigrants. 1 out of every 4 Houstonians was born in a different country.
Including me.
Exactly. And my wife as well. But if you look statistically nationwide, 24% of all nurses are foreign born. We know that through our own experience, many from the Philippines. 28% of all physicians are foreign born from China, India, and elsewhere. And probably here in Houston, being with the Texas Medical Center, I would guess those numbers are even higher.
Absolutely. And it's not just the medical profession. When we're talking about like even how we're getting our PPE, like the N95 masks, protective gear, all that stuff, those are a lot of it is coming through like Asian American owned import-export companies.
Absolutely. The Asian American community, particularly the Chinese American community, has played a key role in making sure that we tap into that market and have enough of those supplies. Both business-wise, but more important, as you know, they have been able to obtain a lot of these supplies on a volunteer basis and have contributed them for no cost as well.
So I think one of the things that maybe a lot of Americans have misconceptions about is that when we talk about immigration, I think everyone automatically goes to the idea of undocumented immigrants, right?
Absolutely.
But there's actually a lot of variation all the way, like a spectrum of immigration status, all the way from undocumented to permanent resident and everything else. And can you explain some of that?
That's right. It's a funny thing when I say I practice immigration law, many people automatically think I have a large clientele crossing the border every night. But we do have a viable legal immigration system. So it typically will, if you look at the people's stories, it may, particularly with Asian immigration, it started with education. Folks coming here to get an education, they graduate, they get what we call practical training, they qualify for H-1B status. The employer then sponsors, that's a temporary work visa classification that's valid for up to 6 years. And then the employer will sponsor them for lawful permanent residency, so-called green card status, by proving the unavailability of U.S. workers. Yeah. Then they become lawful permanent residents, and 5 years later, they are eligible to become U.S. citizens.
Well, and in fact, that's actually how my family came here. My father came here to study nursing and became a nurse because the United States, and especially Texas, had a huge nursing shortage. And I'm not sure he wanted to be a nurse, yeah. but they said, like, if you study, become a nurse, then we'll help you get a green card.
Absolutely. So it's sort of ironic when the legislation was passed, when Lyndon Johnson, a fellow Texan, was president in 1965. The thought was it would not have that big of an impact because it was going to be primarily family-based. But in terms of Asia, there weren't very many Asian Americans who had close enough relatives. But it had a huge impact on the Asian community because they were able to immigrate post 1968 yep. through occupation, through jobs. Yeah. Almost in fact, entirely through the professions.
And it would be fair to say that immigrants have filled in a lot of the really strong needs in our economy throughout the past 3 or 4 decades.
Absolutely. That's really, Gene, as you know, the story of America. We are, to quote the seminal work of John F. Kennedy, a nation of immigrants. We have been and we are today. We have today some of the highest rates of legal immigration. And I think immigrants do the jobs that, frankly, no one else wants to do at the bottom of the food chain. And they often do the most complex jobs at the top of the food chain. If you look at the scientists who win the Nobel Prize, virtually all of them in recent years have been Americans who have immigrated to the U.S., primarily from Asia, frankly.
Well, in fact, I was just looking some of the statistics recently. The vast majority of graduate level students in American universities studying hard science, studying engineering, studying mathematics are all international students, all immigrants as well.
Absolutely. I once talked to a recruiter for Shell, and I was talking to him why we represented Shell at that time, where they were doing that. And he said, well, Charles, if we're going to recruit someone with a PhD in this particular field of science, or even a master's, we know that 90% of the candidates are going to be foreign students. So by definition, we're in the immigration game, and that's what most companies have found.
I mean, if we didn't have immigrants, if the United States didn't have a strong immigration policy, our economy would suffer directly.
Absolutely. We all know, the president has said over and over again, until recently, we've had one of the best economies, one of the lowest unemployment rates. And so think about it. If we didn't have immigrants, but that almost essentially we're at zero unemployment. Look at the undocumented population. If we could have magically removed 11 million people, who would have filled those jobs? And the same thing's true at the top of the food chain as well. All those professionals who have qualified through our legal immigration system.
Right, and just in the news recently, they're talking about that the meat processing plants are now essential to our nation's national security, and the people who work there are, recent immigrants or even undocumented.
Absolutely. They are a cross, they represent all of the countries in the world, from Africa, Latin America, Asia, Europe.
So, and you mentioned the Trump's executive order that he issued. And in fact, you actually wrote an op-ed about why that was such a boneheaded move. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, the op-ed was justified both on health grounds, fear that they bring coronavirus to us,
right,
and economic grounds. It didn't make any sense because all legal immigrants go through a rigorous medical examination right immediately before they're issued the immigrant visa. And secondly, it did not exempt tourists and stuff like that. So why single out legal immigrants? And secondly, on the economy, we know statistically speaking that immigrants create more small businesses than any other group, and they tend to have been the leaders in creating new industries through technology and otherwise. So immigrants have been job creators.
And that's actually an interesting point. I think a lot of people, when they think about immigrants, they think about people coming here being really poor, but what they don't understand is that, yes, they're going to be poor when they first come here because they're coming from countries a lot of times with nothing, just like my family did. But very, very quickly, they're working a lot of hours, or they're studying, they're saving up money, and they're building businesses. And they go from a negative and low levels of income to high levels of income very, very quickly.
That's right. I think you could say that of all the groups, it is the immigrants that truly believe in the American dream, that they can come here and make a better life and achieve what they couldn't in their home countries.
What about all of the non-immigrants in the U.S., the people seeking temporary work visa status with the current administration? Well, will they be restricted as well, or will they get the same treatment under the executive order?
Well, unfortunately, I believe the coronavirus has been used by some to seek restrictions that they have tried to seek for a long time. So the original executive order of April 22nd just applied to immigrants, people coming here on a permanent basis abroad. But in that executive order, there was a paragraph calling for additional measures within 30 days. So it's very clear there will be a second shoe to drop, a second executive order that will apply to non-immigrants that will restrict H-1B classifications, L-1 intercompany transferees, which are the primary non-immigrant classifications. And I might add, particularly the H-1B, there is a maxim in America: we're against illegal immigration, but we want people to come legally. It's been the H-1B classification that is basically the only way that people can get a foothold in America and start working, short of having an immediate family that are U.S. citizens. And so if we restrict that, we're cutting our nose off to spite our face. We benefit from all these students who graduate with these graduate degrees. So I'm fearful, to answer your question, I fully expect within a few weeks we'll have another executive order restricting the H-1B and other non-immigrant temporary worker classifications for 60 days. But I'm also concerned about that because when the Trump administration put on their so-called Muslim ban, it was going to be for 90 days, and that was 3 years ago.
Right. And it's still going.
It's still going.
And for me as a policymaker, I try to think about what are the long-term ramifications of doing this. And, people talk about, well, it's just for 30 days, it's just for 90 days. But I think it sends a very clear message about our country as well. Because we have all these people who are here studying advanced degrees, studying mathematics, engineering, science, and they have a choice. They can go back to their home countries and even go back to China, go back to India, and maybe even make a fortune there. And if they say well, I don't feel welcome here anymore, what does that mean for our country in the long term?
Well, I think it's quite clear it would be a negative. We have continually benefited from these waves of immigration from the very beginning of our of our country. And it could not be even more true today in the high-tech world that we live in. So much of the research that's being done to develop the high-tech has been done, frankly, by graduates of U.S. universities from China, India, and elsewhere. So if we don't keep those people, they're going to go back and do it somewhere else, and we're going to lose the benefit of that brain power.
Yeah. Right. Because, I mean, our United States, we already don't manufacture, when we don't build like the little things, we build like complex things that take a lot of engineering and a lot of expertise. And if our expertise disappears as well, then we can't even make that stuff.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, like, you earlier you're talking about HB1 visas, you're talking about the graduate students are here. I think a lot of people think it's, oh, well, if you just come here, then they'll just let you stay. That's not true, is it? It's actually quite hard to get an HB1.
Absolutely. Again, most Americans do not realize how extremely restrictive our legal immigration system is, and cannot imagine.
And that was even before Trump. That was even before Trump.
That was before Trump. The way the legal system works. For example, for years, I gave a speech as to why Queen Elizabeth could not legally immigrate to the United States, and people would laugh. I picked her because everyone knew something about her work experience and her family structure. But when I took them through all the legal options, they realized that Queen Elizabeth, assuming she wanted to, would not be able to legally immigrate to the United States. Later, relatively recently in our history, they added an investor provision, so clearly she could now immigrate through that investment. But for most, to immigrate through employment, you have to have essential skills where you either can prove that there's not a single willing and able U.S. worker, or to show you're a person of extraordinary ability, you're at the very top of the food chain.
So what about people who already who just received their HB1s or just got approved for it under this new executive order? What's going to happen to them?
Well, currently, if they're here in the U.S. in H-1B status, and that's highly restricted. It's restricted to effectively 65,000 numbers a year, although employers will file somewhere around 250,000 petitions a year, and it becomes a de facto lottery. We have an additional 20,000 numbers for people with advanced degrees from U.S. universities. So currently, if that person is in H-1B status, they can maintain their status for up to 6 years. And during that 6 years, if the employer can prove that there is truly a shortage of U.S. workers, they can stay. And there are two problems. First, we don't know what that second shoe will be, that second executive order, whether or not they're going to be able to extend their H-1B status. And secondly, given the fact we have a growing unemployment rate, it will be more difficult to prove the unavailability of U.S. workers for the time being.
Yeah. And and that's actually maybe a good discussion point. Is I think maybe on the other side, a lot of people say, well, if we had less immigration, then there would be more jobs for Americans. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the best proof of that is the president's own word. We had the best economy in the world, I'm paraphrasing the president, with the lowest unemployment rate just 3 months ago.
Right.
Yet we had very high rates of legal immigration. We also had an undocumented population of 11 million. So if you said we didn't have those, if you took out those million of legal immigrants and 11 million undocumented, it begs the question, what would that have done to our economy? It would have devastated our economy. So right. It all shows that it's a myth that our economy cannot grow with legal immigration. And in fact, referring to the undocumented population, the problem is the only reason they're undocumented is because there is no legal system effectively for low-skilled workers. People will say they should go back and get in line and come in legally. That's a farce. There is no such thing.
I think that's a huge point. That's not being that people don't realize is people say like why can't you do the right way? There is no right way.
Correct.
It doesn't exist. And I think some of the even the waiting lists to come in are huge. Like I think it's like something like a 20-year wait
For
if you're flying from Mexico.
For a family, it could be longer than that through family preferences. For employment, if you're an Indian national, it could be 20 or 30 years to obtain your green card through employment because of the backlogs under the quota. So we really need what's called comprehensive immigration reform. But every time that's brought up, people will oppose that. For one, generally they will oppose it on the grounds that it will hurt the economy. Well, really, in the long run, it helps the economy.
Right. Well, here's sort of my question. Like, in terms of the president's executive order, his basis of it is based on that there's currently a crisis with COVID-19. Is there anything in law that basically will check him and say, like, it's been too long, we have to go back and follow what the law says and not just an executive order? Or is this going to go on until he's out of office?
Well, as I said in that op-ed you referred to, unfortunately, when the president's executive order establishing the so-called Muslim ban or travel ban was challenged in a seminal case, Hawaii versus Trump, that went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court found that under a particular section that the president had broad authority to determine if it's in the national interest to block immigration. So this most recent executive order of October 22nd, frankly, if it was on the book for 60 days, no one would care. But it's going to be there because of the people that are really behind that, I think, in some indefinite way. So it's already being challenged in district court. And I think there will be district court decisions finding that the president did exceed his executive authority. And it's going to go up probably to the Supreme Court, and who knows, but it'll probably be a 5-4 decision again upholding his authority.
That's frightening.
Yes.
Let's change gears just a little bit. In terms of immigration, I think most people are familiar with the public charge rule, saying that that if you are an immigrant and you use government services, you get government assistance, that it's going to be held against you when you're applying for a green card, when you're applying for citizenship. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it also goes to not only whether you receive government benefits, but your level of income that's available to you that would allow you to support yourself and your family, depending upon the size of the family. And clearly the Trump administration has used the public charge provision in ways that it has not been used, at least for decades, that are taking far more extreme interpretations of that, again, in order to restrict legal immigration.
What are the, under the public charge rule, what are the income requirements?
Well, it depends upon the size of the family, but the government has always issues guidelines to which are pretty low, just setting what is the minimum amount that you must make to support your family. And that's what we've always used in the past. But the Trump administration is taking a broader interpretation. They're looking at other factors, highly discretionary factors. I'm familiar with cases where you would be surprised that they denied people's entry on the grounds of public charge.
And potentially, if it's based on income, it could even hurt people who are entrepreneurs because they might be like really highly leveraged.
That's true. That's true. A sad statement about this, I don't want to go back, but one of the more saddest moments in our immigration history was pre-World War II. We had huge quotas for the before the 65 Act for Northern European countries, including Germany, and many pre-war, many, and even during the war in certain countries, many Jewish families sought to immigrate to the U.S., but they were denied entry on public charge, including Anne Frank's family. If you go to where she resided there in in Copenhagen, there's a letter from the consulate denying their entry on grounds of public charge.
It almost sounds like we actually have a long history of using immigration law as a weapon against people that we think are undesirable.
Unfortunately, that's true.
Yeah. Well, I hope that changes one day. So given the public charge rule, what does that mean for immigrants who are already in the United States and they're going through COVID-19? They're under crisis like everyone else. What does that mean for them legally? Should they seek PPP assistance? Should they ask for government help?
Give me a little credit where credit's due. They because we're all in this together, and the government doesn't want to take too narrow a view, because someone that gets contagious, irrespective of their immigration status, they can be they can spread the disease. So they can get governmental assistance here without it being deemed a public charge for immigration purposes.
Okay.
And if there have been some areas where people can go get medical tests and they're not going to enforce immigration laws. Again, that would be cutting your nose off to spite your face. If we were saying to the large undocumented population, we don't want you to seek any medical assistance, because they too can spread the virus to citizens. So the government has encouraged, or let it be known, that they're not going to apply these rules depending upon your immigration status.
Well, but the problem is, as you know, I represent a large immigrant and refugee community in Houston. The problem is we've had like 3 years of the Trump administration telling people about the public charge rule, telling people, that they're gonna come get them. I don't think they've spent any time telling people that, hey, you can get medical services during COVID. You can come get assistance during COVID, and we're not gonna hold it against you.
You're right. Yeah, that's a big issue.
What about DACA recipients?
DACA, as you know, is deferred action for childhood arrival. That was an executive action by President Obama in 2012, when essentially he gave up hope on believing that the House was going to be able to pass any immigration bill. So deferred action is not actually a legal status. It just says the government's not going to seek to remove you, and it does come with a temporary work authorization. So that was routinely extended until our Attorney General threatened to sue, Ken Paxton threatened to sue Trump, who then promptly rescinded President Obama's executive action establishing DACA. DACA refers to those people that were brought here as children, no fault of their own. There was no violation of the law. Dreamers, so-called dreamers. Their parents may have brought them here maybe when they were 1 month old or 2 years old, 3 years. They've grown up here. They're as American as anyone else growing up in America, and yet they have no legal hope or basis to qualify for a number of technical reasons. So the DACA recipients face a rather dim future, because the Supreme Court, any day now, certainly by June, will hear whether or not President Trump actually had the authority. His rescission was enjoined by lower courts, and that's all the way gone up to the Supreme Court now. They will rule on whether or not he had the executive authority to set aside President Obama's executive action. And I feel fairly certain that they will find that, which means almost overnight, close to 800,000 DACA recipients, many of which are in healthcare professions here in Houston and elsewhere, will be thrown into illegal status. Their employers will have no alternative in order to comply with the law to dismiss them from the workforce. So that's the bad news. If there is a silver lining, it will throw this issue back to Congress. And I think Congress broadly supports dreamers. The real problem is what will the White House, specifically Stephen Miller in the White House, what will he try to wrangle in exchange for that? In the past, what they
Right.
wanted was not only an obscene amount of funding for the wall, $50 million, but they wanted to do precisely what they did by that executive action, significantly cutting legal immigration, family-based immigration in particular.
That's terrible. Was there anything in the CARES Act? I read an article that the money, the assistance that's being provided will not be eligible for DACA recipients.
That's true. Not to DACA recipients, not to anyone in undocumented status, not to anyone that has an undocumented immediate member of their family. So an American citizen married to a undocumented would not be eligible.
Wow. What do you think are some of the downstream impacts of immigrants not being able to receive financial relief or the medical support they need?
Well, again, as my mother says, it's cutting your nose off to spite your face. So if people in our community that we interface with, workers in restaurants and every day doing the work, do not have access to medical care, it's in our interest, whether we're talking about the coronavirus or other contagious diseases, that they have access to medical care. If logically, if they're cut off from these benefits, and if some people have said that's a way to force them to leave the country, let's just say that works, and many of them choose to leave the country. An unemployed worker in the oil and gas industry is not going to go start up doing agricultural work or
Right.
Building houses. They're going to find some other work. So if these people aren't here doing the job, even with this growing unemployment rate, it begs the question, who will do that labor?
Right. And I mean, I think a lot of people that argue on the other side haven't like really thought this stuff all the way out, that, you know, part of having a robust economy is having labor that is willing to work for what the job is worth. And, you know, if we have to hire Americans or to hire people who expect $20, $25 an hour wages to pick lettuce, you know, there's going to be a lot of problems up and down the economic chain.
That's true. You know, in this crisis we're going through, there's a lot of talk about us being independent and not dependent upon other countries. So, well, let's just apply what you said to agriculture. If the agricultural industries had to compete with other industries, compete with jobs where you can work in air conditioning, yes, they could do that, but they're going to pass those prices on to American consumers, making American products less competitive and therefore making products in other countries more competitive.
Yeah. And in fact, I think one of the arguments I made in the past is like, you can even pay. I think you could offer, you know, average Americans $20 an hour to go pick lettuce, and I think they still won't do it.
They won't do it
because the work is brutal. It's hot. It's exhausting. You work like 12, 14-hour days. I think people just won't. I mean, even at a higher salary, people will not do that job.
Yeah, the proof of that is that employers have tried that. They've gone all out to recruit U.S. workers, and the U.S. workers will come, start working. They'll be there the first day, maybe the second day, and then they don't show up the third day.
Right. I think we're getting close to getting ready for some questions. Are you ready, Charles?
I'm ready.
All right. I'm gonna have to read these out. Jenny asks for, with so many immigrants working in agriculture and meatpacking industries, can Trump's immigration ban affect supply chains and industries as well?
It could. It could. I would have to say, as you've alluded to, very candidly, most of those workers in meat packing and agriculture that are really labor intensive under bad conditions, that is being done overwhelmingly.
Atrocious conditions.
Excuse me?
Atrocious conditions.
Yes. Overwhelmingly, that's already being done by undocumented workers in the country to begin with. So I'm not, so President Trump's executive order is going to impact more people at the top of the food chain, scientists, people in the STEM fields, engineers, teachers, ballet dancers, people coming here in the professions.
All right, Stephanie asks, how is the Trump immigration executive order impacting the medical field? I mean, when do you think, I mean, he issued the order about a few weeks ago. Do you expect to see an immediate change in something like the medical field?
Well, in fairness, the executive order, and I think this recognizes the political sensitivity, the only occupations exempt were healthcare professionals. So healthcare professionals are not specifically covered by the ban on immigrant visas. Now, we do have this second shoe dropping, the second executive order. So the real question is, will that, and our U.S. Senator today, Ted Cruz, along with Senator Cotton of Arkansas and a few others, they called for a total ban of all temporary work visas for some indefinite period of time without any exemption. So it'll be interesting to see the final, the language in that second executive order.
Without even exceptions for medical professionals who are dealing with COVID-19 right now?
That's correct.
That's insanity.
I agree. I was surprised.
Kevin asks, in the near future, will the immigration system increase the restrictions for those who apply for the H-1B visas from the optional practice training program? That's a very specific question.
Yes, and so what that means—
maybe Kevin needs to hire a lawyer.
What that really means, Gene, just sort of alluding to your dad, people will come here for a great education.
Yeah.
Many of them with no intent to stay, but they find out what we know, this is a fantastic country. When they graduate, they're entitled to 12 months of practical training, and they're in the STEM field, 36 months of practical training. And they get to get their foot in the door and start working for a U.S. employer without being sponsored. So first point, I would say I'm very concerned. In that letter signed today by Ted Cruz, he called for the abolition of optional practical training. What that means is if we did that, not a single person, a foreign student, top of his class from Harvard with a PhD, would be able to remain in the United States. There would be no pathway to an H-1B or other status. So typically, once you get a job, you hope that employer will sponsor you for an H-1B. But that's a crapshoot. That's a lottery because there's only 65,000 or 85,000 numbers, including graduates of U.S. universities with an advanced degree. And each year there are more than 200,000 petitions. So that person has no guarantee they'll be able to get an H-1B number. So now, that's the system.
It just boggles my mind. I mean, I read just, I can't remember where this was, but I was reading a thing that says basically like 85–90% of engineering and mathematics PhD students are international students, are foreign students. And if we basically said, you know what, none of y'all can stay, who's going to do our engineering? Who's going to design our products? Who's going to design our buildings? Who's gonna basically like make and design all the things and take care of all the things that like makes our country run? It just boggles my mind. Like, where are these people going to come from? Where are these jobs going to go? I mean, Americans obviously don't want these degrees and are not interested in going after them, because if they did, they would be in those fields now.
That's true. What happens is, and this is true, An American student will graduate with a bachelor's and be able to get a job. And so foreign students realize to be more competitive, they will stay longer, get higher education. They come from cultures where education is often viewed as a very important thing. But this also gets to an issue that we've talked about, whether it's the coronavirus or the economy or security concerns, immigrants become very easy target to blame the immigrants. And that's been, unfortunately, part of our history.
All right. Oleg asks, what about mixed status families where children are U.S. citizens, but the parents are not? Do they have access to any support from the CARES Act or the PPP?
No, they do not at all. If their kids are U.S. citizens, if they're born here, they're clearly U.S. citizens under the 14th Amendment. The children can petition for their parents, assuming that's necessary.
When they turn 18.
Excuse me?
When they turn 18.
Oh, no. Under immigration law, as an adult, that's defined as 21. Only when they turn 21 can they petition. And even there, it's going to be a challenge because if they're out of status, they're not going to be able to change their status in the country. And if they leave, they become subject to a 10-year bar of prohibition. We have this law, Gene, that says even if you qualify to become an immigrant through family or employment, we're not going to let you. We're going to force you to first wait in your home country for 10 years. And as a result, how many people will actually do that? Virtually no one will go back. If they're here and they've been living here, they finally qualify through family or employment, they're not going to go back and hang out in their country for 10 years.
And leave their families behind. And
that's right. That law actually discourages people from trying to legalize their status.
Ken asks, what about people on EB-5 or E2 visa status? What's their future?
Okay, we're talking about investors. An E2 is a treaty investor where you can get a 5-year visa depending upon a bilateral treaty. We have a bilateral treaty with many countries, unfortunately not with China or India. We do with Pakistan, Taiwan, Japan. And if you make a substantial, and we have with Mexico and Canada, if you make a substantial investment, normally of $200,000, you can get normally a 5-year visa. An EB-5 is for permanent residency, a green card status. There you have to make a minimum investment now of $900,000, but only if the project you're investing in is located in a targeted economic area, a high unemployment area.
But how does the executive order affect them?
Oh, excuse me. It doesn't so far. The executive order does not affect the EB-5 program. So individuals who qualify through investment for an immigrant visa may still do so. Unfortunately, the letter of, again, signed by our friend Ted Cruz said we should also stop investors from entering the country under the EB-5 program. Go figure.
Yeah. May asks for what happens to international students whose semesters were interrupted. Are there any issues for F1 foreign students created by the COVID-19 crisis?
Absolutely, that's an excellent question. Many, of course, when their universities shut down, decided to go home. Regulations were changed, allowing foreign students in the U.S. to maintain their status by continuing to take their courses online. That was an effective change. A person that went abroad could still do that, but he's going to have a challenge to get back here. Of course, many airline flights are stopped. Worse, in order to apply for optional practical training, you must do so 90 days within a 60-day period before you graduate, or 60 days afterwards during that 120-day period. But you can only apply for optional practical training within the U.S. So if you're an F1 student that went back to India or China or wherever, you're not going to be able to apply abroad for your optional practical training.
Yeah. And what do you think what do you think is the realistic chances that they would like do away with or suspend optional practical training?
I'm concerned in this climate because this is a perfect storm for immigration restrictionists who for years have been trying to achieve these goals,
Right.
to use the coronavirus, to use the falling economy to do so. So we don't know, this will be in the second executive order.
Yeah.
But again, I'm going to refer to the letter from our junior Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Cotton of Arkansas, Senator Grassley of Iowa, saying let's abolish OPT, abolish EB-5, abolish all temporary workers. So let's hope that wiser heads in the White House do not hear that.
Well, I don't think they're going to be able to pass it as legislation. I don't think the U.S. House, controlled by the Democrats, would do anything
correct.
close to that.
There's no way they could pass that through legislation. Zero chance. But the fear is that they're going to accomplish
I would think that as an executive order, that would be going too far.
You would hope so. You would hope so.
Yeah. Well, we used to have courts back in the days that would uphold the law. Okay, let's say one more question. Bridget asks, can you share any insights on President Trump's approach to COVID-19 aid, and cities that are referred to as sanctuary cities? I know earlier he had tried to condition federal assistance on cities promising to not be a sanctuary city, although I don't know if anyone actually has a definition of what that actually is. Has that got struck down, right?
Yeah, I think that was an idea that the administration threw out, but they realized how extremely stupid that was. Again, getting back to the expression, cutting your own nose off to spite your face, that cutting off that aid where we're all in this together and we don't care what your status is, high or low. We don't want people walking around that are symptomatic. So
right.
that was dropped. But you're absolutely right. This whole term of sanctuary cities is really a misnomer. Only the federal government has the authority to enforce immigration laws. Right. Cities and states are not mandated anymore to carry out federal immigration laws than they are to carry out any number of other federal laws. And
in fact, there's actually Supreme Court cases saying that it's actually illegal for state governments to try to enforce immigration law.
That's true. In the Arizona versus, I can't remember the Attorney General, they struck down a number of laws that Arizona had enacted on the grounds that federal laws preempted state laws. But again, this is exaggerated. I think the tension in this area is whether or not certain states or certain counties will notify the immigration of individuals being held for relatively minor crimes. They always let the immigration know about people being held for serious crimes.
Yeah. I think it bears repeating, as we did during our debate in the Texas legislature on sanctuary cities, is there are no sanctuary cities.
That's true.
There are cities that are friendly to immigrants, who treat immigrants with respect, no matter what their legal status is, and cities that provide support and care for immigrant communities, no matter what their status is. But there is no place in America where immigration law is not enforced. I think that bears repeating.
That's correct.
All right. Let's see. I'm not sure who's asking this, but if the U.S. seems to be turning away international students, there seems to be a growing number of international students are choosing to study in China instead. Is that a concern?
Yeah, I think it's a big concern. I tell you what, Canada, for example, comes to mind also. They are actively saying, advertising here, saying, hey, if the U.S. doesn't want you, we want you. Come here. We welcome you. We're not going to treat you like they do in the U.S. And in terms of China, I think that's primarily these very bright, highly motivated students from China that have stayed here in the U.S., become part of our communities, have become citizens, that instead of doing that, they're going to go back and because there are great opportunities in China. Well, China,
Where the money is.
yeah, China is, and the idea that somehow that we're going to cut China off from technology is ridiculous too, because that's where so much of the technology has been created.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's also a big point. I think there has been an increasing hostility and stupidity in talking about relationships with China. I think we have Matt Gaetz, the congressman from Florida, who was suggesting that we should start seizing Chinese-owned properties in the U.S. And like, what Chinese-owned properties? They're owned by Chinese corporations, and most of them are along with U.S. investment. Are we just seizing random companies' properties now? Or are we becoming Venezuela? I don't expect you to answer that. I'm just ranting here.
Well, I would like to say, because this is another issue I focus on other than immigration law, I think one can legitimately say China criticize, just like we can criticize our own government, that
absolutely
could have done something better. But the idea we're going to blow up this most important bilateral relation, to paraphrase former President George H.W. Bush, is insane, because China represents 1/4 of humanity. It has an economy the size of the U.S. economy, and it will inevitably be larger.
I think it's actually bigger now.
We need, precisely because we have these issues with China, we have to have a working, constructive bilateral relationship to work through these issues, whether it's contagious diseases, the environment, military tension, and the world economy.
Right. Well, I mean, look, I've said this to people before. It's like, look, I have a lot of issues with China. I mean, like, a lot of it has to do with the Uyghurs, with Hong Kong, and all this other stuff. But for us, like, look, if you don't like it, how do you expect them to listen to you if they're your enemy? If you've pushed them away from the table and kicked them out the door, and then you say, well, we want you to do what we tell you to do, and we would really like you to do it our way, like, why would they ever listen?
Correct.
So anyways, all right, I think that's all the time we have. Hold on. I'm supposed to read a closing remark. Charles, thank you so much. You're a treasure for our community. I know we've been actually on a lot of panels together, and you are a pearl of wisdom in this time of crisis. So thank you so much. Say hi to your lovely wife for me.
Thank you. Same to Maya.
So everybody, thank you for joining us this evening. Please tune in again next Thursday at 7:30 Central Time for Asia Society's weekly COVID-19 webcast. The next week's topic is going to be coping with the stress of COVID-19. This is a serious, serious topic. Mental stress has no barriers. It impacts all people across all economic spectrums. Join Asia Society for a conversation with Dr. Limbo, Senior Director, Practice Research and Policy at the American Psychological Association, on the science behind anxiety, fear, and other stressors that may be experiencing, that people may be experiencing, and suggestions on how to cope with this crisis during the pandemic. A really important topic. I know a lot of people are very stressed out, and I know a lot of people who are very depressed right now. And we need to figure out how to help ourselves and how to help others. So learn more about this upcoming webcast through Asia Society's website, and check out the hashtag Asia Society at Home. Thank you so much. Have a great evening and be safe.